Alright, so this should be a fun little experiment. I thought it'd be cool if I did a commentary on each of the scripts of Growing Around. I'll be going into my experiences in creating this world and the challenges that each script and episode had provided. I said that I'm going to be reviewing these in chronological order, but it's not exactly simple to say chronological order. I'm going to be reviewing these in the order in which they're meant to be read or experienced, not the order that I had written them. There is a difference, and we'll get to why as we get to those moments. When we get to episodes where I've jumped around, I will explain why I've jumped around. Either way, the first episode is Max's Many Birthdays. Now, if you're watching this, I'm going to assume that you know what Growing Around is, for the most part. For a general overview, Growing Around is meant to be a cartoon show, although we've been experimenting with other mediums such as books and graphic novels. No matter what though, the premise of Growing Around is the same. If you're not in the know, it follows an average family of four, the Dunns. We have the wild and energetic daughter Sally. She can be a little bit of a ditz, but she has a good heart. She likes her friends, family, and animals. Then there's her older brother Max, who seems to have a lot of worry for his young age. And then there's the parents, the mother Autumn, always serious and never has much time for kid stuff, and the father Robert, who is always willing to get into the kids' games. That's very good for Robert and not so much for Autumn, because his family lives in a world where the kids are in charge. They've completely built society from the ground up in their image. And the episodes follow the crazy kind of adventures that you might experience in this world. Everything from Sally and Max suing each other over a cereal box toy, to Sally taking a ride on a pirate cruise, or school picture day involving the faculty getting their adult students as messy as possible. If you are in the know, you might know that this wasn't the first script that I wrote that had the name Growing Around branded on it. Max's Many Birthdays was written in 2017, July of 2017 to be exact, and I had been tinkering and toying with Growing Around since August of 2014. I refer to the era before Max's Many Birthdays as the proto-era, and I won't be going too deep into any of the previous scripts, the scripts before Max's Many Birthdays, unless they're relevant to the script that I'm talking about. Some of them did get rewritten into a more modern form, such as Sally and Delilah, or Pinks and Blues. Some of them got changed majorly as they did so. Detention Hoppers had several rewrites and finally made it in as Detention Prevention. I'm actually glad that it took me so long to get a pilot that I could be proud of, because the pilot, in terms of shows, is actually a really bad idea. Like, pilots are a really, really bad way of showcasing a television show, especially if your show is anything other than an episode a week kind of deal. I do get the point of the pilot. It's more or less a pitch towards the audience, and in it, it's supposed to establish the setting, the characters, and the tone, but it feels like it's something that belongs in the past. It's something that we've outgrown, or we should be outgrowing. Because pilots have become more and more of a problem in the modern era. Actually, I kind of think that it's always been a bit of a problem, but it's getting worse and worse now. Let me put it this way. In terms of animation, tell me what your favorite pilot ever is. It has to be a show that actually came out, so nothing like Constant Pain or The Modifiers. So after you've done that, tell me if that's your favorite episode of the show. Honestly, if the answer is yes, that's probably a bit tragic, isn't it? Because there's a lot of tragedy in the idea of a pilot. The pilot is the episode, bar none, that you have to work the hardest on. And if any single episode of the show you get afterwards is worse than the pilot, that's not a good episode of the show, is it? And quite honestly, it's been a very long time since I've seen a show whose pilot episode, or even their first episode, was even in a similar league to what the show would become. BoJack Horseman, for instance, which episode will you use to identify with the show? Would it be episode 1, the actual pilot episode, or would it be something like Downer Ending, The Telescope, Escape from LA? As far as I'm concerned, the pilot of Steven Universe's episode 52, Jailbreak, if we're talking about the episode that's supposed to sell a show. I mean, when I think of the really great pilots as pilots, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, Samurai Jack, they tend to have one thing in common. They're movies. They are not single episodes there to tell you the concept of the show in 11 or 22 minutes. They are 44 minutes to over an hour. They have time to breathe. And keep in mind, Samurai Jack has a relatively simple concept. And if that needed to be a movie to get its point across, you can see how tough of a job that a pilot has it. Now, I am absolutely crazy. Borderline insane. I'm not going to begin to deny this. No sane person in history has ever just called up their friend on Skype and said, "Hey, I'm gonna make a cartoon. I've got no talent, experience, or clue as to what I'm doing. Wanna join me?" But even then, I understood that a pilot movie, no matter what media the Growing Around was eventually going to be, the story the length of a movie would not fly. Even having a 22 to 26 minute episode pilot was pushing it further and further beyond plausibility. People had suggested that I make the pilot episode a short, not just an 11 or even a 7-minute episode. People who were working with me at the time suggested that I tell something in 3 minutes, or in some tragic cases, even less. I have made a lot of mistakes in this great adventure of making my own series, and we're gonna get to them sooner or later, but making Growing Around a 22-minute episode type show was not a mistake. I am very glad that I stuck to my guns on this one. For a while, I did try to compromise, and at some point, I even tried writing shorter stuff. I even wrote up some smaller projects, like less than a minute of time length of stuff for them to get their bearings, at their request. Nothing ever got finished way back when. In cases like this, it would be very easy to blame my teammates, and I'm not saying that every single decision that they made was stellar, but when I look into my past with Growing Around, a quote comes to my mind from A Bug's Life of all things.
First rule of leadership: everything is your fault.
I know it's said by the villain of the movie, but it's actually good advice. And it's something that I take into my overall life. If the people I work with screw up, and the screw-ups slip by me, it is my fault. There is no excuse. It's my fault the second that I decided this is okay in some way, shape, or form. And someone blaming their employees or the people they work with is one thing that instantly sinks my respect of them. So let's talk about the 22-minute thing. From what I can tell, Max's Many Birthdays is going to be a long episode. I don't know if the eventual product is going to be long as, say, Has Been Hotel, but it's definitely pushing the 26-minute realm. If you don't know, 26-minute length shows are usually only given to shows that are really, really valuable. These are your Family Guys and your Simpsons. The few ads that they do have are really expensive. Now, if Growing Around were ever to become a cartoon, it would obviously debut on the internet. So technically speaking, I can make each episode as long or as short as I want it. But I do like keeping it relatively around an actual television length of 22 to 26 minutes per episode. It keeps the storytelling style consistent. You can expect similar beats throughout each episode, giving it a consistent flow. You can tell when a story is supposed to be winding down, and it does give me personally a good guide as to how long I'm going on and when I need to start wrapping things up. I don't ever go longer than this time unless it's like a 2 or 3-parter episode, so no story overstays its welcome. There were many times in writing these scripts that I felt there was more and more I could do with each premise and plot, but at some point you have to stop and work on the next story. I've got a lot of scripts to write. If you're wondering, there are planned to be 175 scripts total. And if you think that that's a crazy number that no one could possibly reach, I've already written about 70 of them, myself. And these are the ones that I considered good enough to be canon. This discards all of the proto-scripts, the previous drafts, and even some scripts that I wrote after Max's Many Birthdays like Marble Madness. Even if nothing becomes of anything of this, I am confident that I will get all of these scripts written at some point. It is something that I could absolutely see myself doing. In 2019 alone, I wrote 34 scripts, and I'm proud of pretty much each and every one of them. While some do need editing, I like the general quality and the ideas within them. So, why did I never want to do a short episode? There are several reasons. Number one, as any kind of artist, you need to play to your strengths, and you have to downplay your weaknesses. And brevity is one of my weaknesses, as you might be able to tell from the length of this video. When I get into something, I like to be thorough. Take an episode like, say, the Halloween episode, Riker's Revenge. If we didn't see how as many characters as possible were enjoying the holiday and dealing with the unusual traditions of a Growing Around holiday, I feel like, well, at worst, I've wasted a premise, but at typical, I feel like I'd be shortchanging the idea. I only have so many episodes to work with. I need to do as much as possible with each of them, especially since I don't want any plots to be redundant. And keep in mind, I'm not just someone who throws every little thing I can think of into each and every episode without cutting anything. These episodes get big with me cutting things back. And even then, there are episodes like Brave New Girl or Sour Limelight. They construct these big worlds that have so many ideas that feel too painful to cut back. Like, if I were to start doing novels of Growing Around again, these episodes would definitely get the full, like, Harry Potter-sized novel treatment. And I suppose that brings us to reason number 2 of why this couldn't be a short episode. Many of the stories that I tell need to be big because they have a lot going on. And I mean this in a couple of ways. First is the obvious way, the way that you can see. Growing Around has a lot of characters that are important to the overall show, and in a pilot, it's important to get as many as possible on screen, and to introduce them. So, we have the 5 main duns. That's Sally, Max, Autumn, Robert, and their pet pony Gumdrops, who we'll talk about in another episode. Sally also has a stuffed chameleon toy that's her favorite, but we probably don't have to establish that in a pilot. But Sally is going to be driving the plot of this episode. She is the main character of the series, so we should definitely at least see her friends. That's April and Molly. But the episode is also about Max, so we have to deal with his acquaintances as well. That's Shelly, Niall, Nevin, Anna, and Steve. That's a dozen characters, at the bare minimum. Could you give each and every one of these characters a showcase? Sure, here's a showcase of all of the characters. Don't you just love their personalities and remember all those glistening moments with them? I remember when Anna was standing by the cake. A better question is, can you showcase all these characters while telling a story? Well, The Loud House did in a short time, but here's a question. Can you tell a story that isn't directly focused on all of them? Keep in mind, at this stage in the game, April doesn't know Anna and Molly doesn't know Niall. They're a friend of a friend at best. Unlike Loud House, where all the characters were familiar and family to begin with. Could someone do it in 3 minutes? Sure. I'm not that somebody. I couldn't do it in 11 minutes. And with Max's Many Birthdays, even 22 minutes was pushing it. And that's even with having one of the simpler stories that I've told with Growing Around. That's another reason that the episodes need to be longer. The stories of Growing Around are incredibly nuanced. While there are a couple of stories and episodes that are Looney Tunes type gags just meant to be 22 minutes of comedy, that's not often the case. A while back on my main channel, I did something called Mixed Messages, where I dove into the moral of swearing, and how some cartoons like SpongeBob or Arthur went deep into how you shouldn't swear, and not giving much of a reason beyond don't. Or even worse, because I said so. Growing Around's morals are kind of based on the same desire that I went into while making that Mixed Messages video. This is one of the reasons that I love the premise of Growing Around. Kids ruling the world. It removes a lot of the crutches that other cartoons, other kid stories in general use. How do you deal with a bully, for instance? Well, let's ask any other cartoon.
You know, this all could have been avoided if y'all just came to me in the very beginning.
Well, in Growing Around, at best, the adults in your life are at school. You're going to need to find some other way to deal with your own problems. You have to deal with this bully yourself. The adults are not an option here. There are no because I told you so morals in Growing Around, because there just can't be. A kid saying, because I said so, is definitely not going to be very well respected among their peers. There is a swearing episode, and because I picked that message, I needed to deconstruct the lesson and come up with a valid answer that would actually apply to the real world. The kids' ruling aspect of Growing Around isn't just set dressing. It's not there just so crazy and wacky things can happen, and it's not always just satirical either. Growing Around takes the lives of kids and the things that they might encounter with grown-up seriousness. It's a show that has adult conversations about children's issues and problems, things that they might be going through. It's not always a moral thing either. The show goes into aspects like worrying if your best friend forever won't always be your best friend forever, dealing with why a parent might lie to you and how to process those emotions. In Max's Many Birthdays, we tackle a very simple moral, that of growing up. I remember watching an episode of Sabrina the Animated Series of all things. In that episode, Sabrina either used a spell or a wish or whatever, I don't remember exactly, but in that episode, she got to be an adult, and the message of that episode was that adulthood sucked. You'd have the happiest life possible if you got hit by a bus on your way home from your high school graduation. I'm exaggerating, slightly. It was an attempt at the don't hurry to grow up moral. Cartoons that did this made me mad. Well, no, they made me paranoid. They constantly made it seem like your life was all downhill the second you were not a kid anymore. Anything good you liked or did would be gone, and it would take severe consequences to keep enjoying them. Grand old ironies, my adulthood so far has been the best part of my life. Many times in Growing Around, I do take stabs at morals that I come to despise in children's media. For instance, we're going to see a lot about the boys versus girls plot that comes up a lot in other shows. The big secret here is that Growing Around is not a straightforward show. Growing Around is more or less a deconstruction of kids' shows. I've jokingly described it as BoJack Horseman for kids. It's not, but in some sense, there is definitely some influence from BoJack Horseman. You see, that thing that you see on television is absolutely bullshit, and there's a lot of reality, sometimes harsh reality, behind it. Season 2, for instance, has two main messages. Number 1, if you want to beat a bully, you do have to stand up to them, and it's not going to be easy. You will be worse for the wear as you go about it. Number 2, popularity is actually important. It is important to what other people think of you. The popular people are the ones who tend to influence society and create the systems that control our lives. You have to be at least a little bit popular to win an election, don't you think? Sometimes, though, especially in Season 1, messages are a bit more refreshing and happier and summery. Growing up isn't so bad. And I know what you might be thinking. This show, Growing Around. This is the show where kids call all the shots, and the adults don't have any of the privileges that they did in the real world. You're telling me that you really think that this kind of show is the kind of show to give the message, it's okay to grow up and be an adult? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, I do. In fact, this concept in this show is the best place to teach that moral. If I can sell kids on it being okay to be an adult here, in my world, then it's sold to them everywhere else. How well did I do it within Max's Many Birthdays? Well, that's up to you. But I do think that this lesson is important to hear, whether I did it well or not. I've noticed a lot of young people, hell, I've talked to a lot of young people who are really scared of becoming an adult and being on their own for the first time ever, and it's really sad to see this. Now, there's something special about this message. It is the kind of message about the first episode of the show, but it's the same message throughout the entire series. If you want me to get all literature class on you, Max's Many Birthdays message is basically the thesis statement to the overall theme of the show. Growing Around is a show about growing up, and that's both literal and figurative. In this episode, Max turns 12, which to him means that he's got 1 year before he's a teenager. Now, in growing around, teens are seen largely as kids. They've got all the same rights and such, but someday soon, Max will probably feel that his employees will stop respecting him. He'll lose everything that he's ever worked for. He might even be too big to fit into his car's driver's seat. And here's the thing, as the story and the seasons go on, we're gonna see this. We're gonna see this firsthand. Growing Around is a show in which the characters age. How old will they get? Old enough to matter. Old enough to make a difference in the show's dynamics. If you want me to get more specific than that, you'll either need to follow along and I'll give you the answers as we get to them, or read ahead. That would be very nice. I always appreciate new readers to my series. The fact of the matter, though, is that Growing Around is a show where the characters have to age. I come to this conclusion a while ago, because it's another one of those things that sounds very counterintuitive. You'd think that in a world where kids rule, it'd be the most fun and appealing to never have the characters worry about silly little things like growing up, and keeping our kids as kids forever and ever, and continuing on these crazy adventures for however many seasons The Simpsons has. It really is tempting to make that a part of the fantasy, but once again, this is incredibly important to have. The characters aging is super important to the integrity of the show, and I believe that it rises the show to a new height. Max and Sally especially, do put their parents through a lot of chaos, as you might expect in a world where kids call all of the shots. But there's an unspoken understanding between the kid characters and the adult characters. One day, the shoe will be on the other foot, and they know this. When Sally is getting Autumn to play superheroes in the park or whatever, Sally is acutely aware that one day her own kids are going to be making her play some kind of game that she might not all be into. We'll be getting more into that specific theme in the swearing episode, believe it or not. Yes, they are related. I suppose that brings us to the other big thing that I had to establish in this show, and that's the premise. Now, as I've said before, I am completely crazy, but I thought that the premise of Growing Around was a very easy one to understand. It just sounds like a standard cartoon premise. At the very least, I expected it to be a lot easier than some people have had with it. It's just a role reversal story, people. But a lot of people thought that the characters in the show would have, like, Benjamin Button syndrome, in which they age backwards. The characters don't. The characters age up. And a lot of the difficulties in making this series is figuring out exactly how seriously to take all of these questions. Like, during my Indiegogo campaign a couple of years ago now, we had to put, like, these basic facts that people grow up and get older, basically, on our streams, so people would stop asking us this very basic question that probably shouldn't even need to be answered. It's been said that you will never go broke underestimating the intelligence of the common public, but I didn't want to believe that very much. In terms of explaining this concept, there really should be only two things that I need to say. Actually, only one thing. In this world, kids rule. I shouldn't even have to say that people age normally, because that's how fiction and fantasy works normally. This is like grade 2 reading comprehension. Things work as they do in reality, unless otherwise stated, in all media ever. This is as basic to reading books as knowing that the people in the movie can't see you in film. I never gave the impression that this would be a reverse aging thing, and it frustrates me to no end that so many people assumed that for what I can only assume is no reason. Max's Many Birthdays doesn't go much into explaining why kids are in power, it just showcases it as is. It's not about asking the questions, although I'm not too sure that that was the best possible solution. I don't really think that there was a best possible solution, maybe even a good solution, considering that the pilot had a lot of heavy lifting to begin with, and this was not the episode to explain how kids came to power over adults, or the intricate nature of the society. Let me put it this way. You don't read the Silmarillion before you read Lord of the Rings. That'd be completely stupid, and it'd be completely stupid to expect to get that before you read Lord of the Rings. Like, that was one of the mistakes of the first pilot I wrote, where people kept demanding an answer, and I kept feeling forced to put it in, even though it had nothing to do with the actual story on the face of it. Even beyond that, though, people kept getting confused in new and mystifying ways that continually surprised me. I don't think that I'm overreacting in my annoyance when people said, and I quote, that I have to, like, it's not optional, it's something that I have to explain how pedophiles work in my show that is aimed at children. I don't have to explain why this is the stupidest request that I have ever gotten, right? To be absolutely fair, things didn't always get that outrageous, but there was a constant annoyance with the questions that people asked. So, from this point onward, I am going to apologize preemptively for the hostilities, but if you have any questions about my world and how it works, and you absolutely demand to know what it is if you think it's going to be important to enjoying the show, the one answer you're going to get is read the scripts. If it's there, it's there. If it's not, it's not. If you're interested in finding the answers, then you might be interested in the show. If you're not, you're probably just messing with me. And I have literally no reason to assume that you're not. I'm in the business of writing a story, not a fictional almanac. I owe literally zero explanation to my premise. That is the definition of a premise in fiction. Any explanation you get with my premise is a bonus. Like, one of my favorite things that people told me, and they told me this frequently, it wasn't just one person this time. I got this a lot. So, this is a world in which, at some point, younger people are just going to replace you at your work, and society is basically just going to boot you to the side. That sounds like a horrifying world. And I'm like, open your eyes, dumbass. You live in that world already. It's on a lot slower of a time scale, but yeah, in your life, in your real world life, someone younger and with more energy and new ideas than you is going to replace you doing whatever you're doing now. And you're going to be the person who has the problem if you don't accept that. And it's criticism on this level that I've been dealing with constantly since damn near the beginning. And I know you're supposed to accept constructive criticism. This isn't constructive because this kind of criticism makes it harder and harder for the product to be actually good. So I've had to more or less pick and choose what I've had to listen to. Unless, of course, you want a pilot that's just 10 hours of backstory. My favorite piece of criticism was people saying that they'd kill themselves if they lived in the world of Growing Around. Like, that was a problem with the concept or something. Like, planning a vacation spot is the same thing as planning a fantasy series. I wouldn't want to live in the world of, I don't know, The Quiet Place myself, but that doesn't mean it's a bad movie. I wouldn't want to live in the world of Samurai Jack. If you're saying that's the point of those worlds, there's supposed to be a place you don't want to live, there's plenty of cartoon and media worlds that I wouldn't want to live in. Like any superhero show ever. Fucking hell, I wouldn't even want to live in the world of Equestria, a show that I still have the reputation of being obsessed with. I've just been holding a lot of frustration, and it made making a pilot episode even harder than it should have been. Actually, these kind of questions and this kind of feedback has made it harder to do a lot of things. Like, it makes it harder to market a series, to narrow it down to its important core elements, and just basically even just talk about it. Believe it or not, I blame fandom culture for this, which really took off through the 2010s. I wouldn't be having these problems if I was making the show in like the 90s or the 2000s, and I have a feeling the fandom culture is going to affect things in a bad way going forward into the next decade as well. Back in my day, episodes were episodes, stories were stories, and characters were characters. Nowadays, every single background character needs a name, a family, and a personality that must be honored and never stray. Once upon a time, a tree was just a tree, and now we need to know what kind of tree it is, who planted it, when and why, what lives in the tree, and every single story that has ever happened in this tree. It's, kind of annoying as someone who makes a show. It's even more annoying being someone who kind of had a part in creating this culture, and so I don't come across like a total dick. It's okay if these things are important to you as a viewer in any series. We all have those little extra characters that we really, really like. But you have to understand that as a creator, these should not be our priorities. We need to focus on the main characters, the main nuts and bolts. Once again, any of these other stuff is just extra. Some things are better left in the realm of fan fiction and fan art. If you are creating your own series yourself, one thing that I will have to tell you to do, one stellar piece of advice that I think you should understand, please realize what is your job to figure out and what is the fan fiction writer's job to figure out. Even though I do take a lot of that logic into writing many of the episodes of my own show. For instance, just because I'm the creator doesn't mean I don't ship some of my characters. Oh boy, this will be a fun thing to talk about when I get to Pinks and Blues, where one small little strange thing of that episode basically sparked a whole arc of this series. As for Max's many birthdays, though, with all the questions and stuff, I am actually kind of happy with the way things are. We don't learn why kids are in charge in the first episode because that's not important for the first episode. We will get to know eventually, but if you can't accept a cartoon premise on episode 1 as a cartoon premise, you probably shouldn't be watching cartoons. And, you might have to go to a Growing Around school for a few days until you get it. Sorry, I've just been building up, like, years of frustration on this one little point. In terms of writing a fictional story, you have one gimme. One thing that you can have with no explanation whatsoever. This is a universal thing. Dexter has a laboratory that nobody knows about. There would be many plot holes to this thing existing if it wasn't the premise of the series. Professor Utonium was able to make superpowered kindergartners. BoJack Horseman has anthropomorphic animal people. walking around. Growing around takes place in a world where kids rule. I don't know if this is a unique premise, but it's certainly not a strange one. And to this day, I have no idea why people have had such a hard time getting it. Maybe the vast majority of them are trolls trying to spite me, I don't know. At the end of the day, sometimes I just feel like some people are playing stupid, and some people aren't playing. In Max's Many Birthdays, though, I did my best to try and compromise on some of the confusion. I clearly showed that kids are in charge and that the adults had to do what they say, even if not in the most obvious ways. We have a child mayor, we have kids leading their parents around, kids driving, and so on. And I also showed that people do age. Autumn explains that she was at one point a kid, and the whole point is about Max getting older and worried about getting more and more old. And I suppose that's another note to touch on. While Growing Around has the overall theme that growing up is okay, Max's Many Birthday touches on a bit of a different moral. I've described Sally often as the kid that I wanted to be growing up, or at least the kid that I wish that I was. Really active, not so afraid of acting silly, and always willing to show her ideas to others. Max is a closer reflection to the kind of kid that I was, and he probably has more of me in him than most other characters. He's often inside his head for too much of his own good, and as such, many of his scenarios and his worries are things that I have worried myself. Max's Many Birthdays was spawned in part by my thanatophobia, a fear of death or being dead. Aging and death aren't too far off from each other, as I'm sure you're well aware, and they work great as metaphors for each other. And this episode was kind of a way of helping me work through that. More than a few episodes of the show are me going through my own beliefs, my own fears, my own problems, and my own thought processes, deconstructing them, and trying to come up with some happy, healthier medium. That might seem a little bit, I don't know if self-centered is the right word, but on the surface of it, it does sound self-indulgent. Many of the morals in several episodes are usually for me, first and foremost. Many of the scenarios I created are tantamount to thought experiments. Once again, though, I have to say, I think that this might be one of the best ways to tell a moral, albeit one of the strangest ways. The moral needs to make sense to me personally. It needs to apply to my own world, and I need to justify the end results to myself. And sometimes, with episodes like No Boy Left Behind and The B Word, it has moved my thought processes, if only a small bit. So how do you deal with the fear of growing older, or dying? It's really simple, actually. You just stop. At the end of the episode, Max learns that worrying about the future like he was, doing nothing but worrying about the future, was stupid and counterintuitive. Any of the things that he did while he was afraid and panicking obviously don't help when his fears eventually do become realized. You slowly waste the present about an event that you can do nothing about. And it might not be the happiest moral ever, but it's the best possible solution to this one. Next time, we're going to see what school is like in a world where kids are sending their parents to class, and what it takes for a 4-year-old to get control of a classroom full of adults. Join us in episode 2. Class is now in question. Oh, and for those who think I'm being egotistical or crazy or whatever, talking like 30 minutes about something that's never ever gonna be made, I have a surprise for you. And it's also a surprise for those who've had the patience to hear me out.
Are we there yet?
No, Sally.
Mom?
No, not yet.
Ugh. How about now? Are we there yet?
Sally, you're the one driving.
Oh, yeah. Does that mean we're there yet?
Crosswalk, Sally. My parents could drive better than you. Just an average day in Summerway.